was a quick month. The election, a month ago tonight, the transition, the swearing in, the new cabinet, and now summits around the world. It's been a heady time for Liberals, but now two key promises for the new government have some questioning whether the Prime Minister can or even should deliver on them. Is the honeymoon over? Andrew's off this week, Chantal is in Montreal, and joining us from Ottawa, Althea Raj of the Huffington Post, and Jennifer Ditchburn of Canadian Press. Let me start by showing everybody three pictures, because there's a lot of fuss today about how things went for Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama. They were all hugs and smiles today on their first big meeting. That was today. This was 2006. No accounting for the clothes here, but George Bush and Stephen Harper, they were all smiling and huggy on their first meeting. And those are Conservatives. The first two, of course, were kind of Liberals. But it always seems to happen this way. This was Stephen Harper and Barack Obama on their first meeting in 2009. So while lots of people are making judgments about pictures, really, that's kind of always what happens, certainly on first meetings. But in terms of what we saw today and what we heard about, anything significant in this first meeting between the leaders of Canada and the U.S.? Chantal?
Well, two things. One, that was apparent, there is something that Barack Obama does seem to want from Justin Trudeau and want quickly, and it is ratification of this Trans-Pacific trade deal that the American president sees as part of his legacy. The second was absent, obviously, from the picture, but it is the fact that a year from now, Justin Trudeau is going to have to do it all over again with the new president.
That's true. Jennifer, what did you see significant today?
Well, just going back to those pictures you showed, I was there in 2006 in Cancun when Harper met with George Bush. And, at the time it was the same situation. It was a president that was on his way out. At the time it can seem like, they're so friendly and so on. But even at that time, Harper had to concede that Canadians were going to have to show their passports at the border if they wanted to cross it over into the United States. So I think we'll have to give it a little bit more time to see what happens. Often the United States presidents, they're not thinking about Canada as much as we're thinking about them.
Althea?
I don't think there was that much significant that came out of today's meeting. I mean, other than the fact that they seemed to like one another and we had the pro forma invitation to the White House. But I think it's sort of the behind the scenes stuff that's happened. I mean, clearly the Trudeau team and the Obama team are trying to sow some strong relationship and some deeper bonds there. We had Obama's senior advisor on climate come visit us in Ottawa. We had Jerry Butts, the Prime Minister Trudeau's principal secretary, visit Obama's chief of staff in Washington on Tuesday. I mean, those sort of behind the scenes stuff are what get issues solved quickly or, make them last longer. And I think that that's part of the narrative of really deepening those Canada-U.S. bonds.
All right. Well, what happened in Paris a week ago tomorrow has kind of changed the dynamic around a lot of issues for a lot of people around the world. And one wonders whether or not they're going to impact on some of the key promises that the Liberals made during the campaign. And I'm thinking primarily, first of all, of the promise to pull the CF-18s out of the fight against ISIS, and also the promise about bringing 25,000 refugees into Canada before the end of the year. We've seen the kind of reaction that has prompted among some quarters in the last little while. And as a result, this question about honeymoon starts to come up. Before I ask it, tell me about these things. Can he still deliver? Should he still deliver on those two key promises? Chantal?
I think the one involving the bombing mission and pulling out of it to do something else is the easier one to sell. It probably was counterintuitive to insist on that pulling out against the backdrop of Paris. But at the end of the day, we account for 2% of those bombing missions before the French add new planes in the air to bomb. So I do think many Canadians will probably discover that we are going to be beefing up how many military personnel we have on the ground, 69 at this point, and it may end up being a more significant commitment. The refugee issue, I think, is completely different. And what happened this week was really interesting. You didn't hear any government leader, municipal or provincial in this country, say what you hear in the United States, please don't send anyone my way or send less people or take in less people. But the concerns were from people, mayors, premiers who do want those refugees to come, but who do understand that if it is a logistical boondoggle, that there will be no trust, no public confidence in the process. And Canadians are going to be paying more attention to that process now.
Althea, what are you hearing on this?
Well, two things. One, to answer your question, I think he absolutely has to deliver on the promises that he made. Whether or not he actually meets his own timeline, I don't know. But, you know, he brought in hundreds of thousands of people who had never voted before under this guise of not being cynical about politics and this sort of positive message. And then to go and to suggest that his first actions should be to go against his promises, I think is really unrealistic. But there are some deep issues that Chantal raises, and I think a lot of other people have raised. If, for example, ISIS really does, maybe in the months or the years ahead, develop capability to have chemical weapons, something that AP reported today that the Iraqis are worried about. I think then maybe, you know, you start looking at bombing missions in a different light. I think it's far likely that we're going to have not just a more substantive training mission, but that there will be increased contributions in other ways to the ISIS mission. On the refugee issue, I think that the Liberal government thus far has not adequately communicated to Canadians how it plans to screen these people and what security benchmarks actually already exist and what the processes that we usually follow that will be followed. And that, I think, is a communications problem more than, you know, in addition to being a logistical nightmare. I think that's something they could have done, you know, a week or 2 weeks ago.
All right, Jennifer, you're nodding on that.
Yeah, I agree completely on explaining the screening process. I think in the kind of a media environment that we live in is 24/7 media and social media environment, it's really hard for leaders not to want to respond immediately to every question that reporters have. You know, you have to respond immediately to a crisis. And it would be really refreshing if leaders would just say, give us a second, we're going to think this over, what's the best approach? So on the one hand, I think that Trudeau is doing that on ISIS. He's saying, what's the best way for Canada to deal with ISIS? We're going to think this through. We're going to think where we have the best resources to commit. But on the refugee issue, I think he could very well say, and still be respected for it, say, we still want to bring 25,000 people, but if we can't do it by December for any number of reasons, resources in Canada and so on being among them, then give us a little bit more time. And I think Canadians would actually respect that.
And that does seem to be the issue that for a lot of people who are all for bringing in more refugees are concerned about, and that is the speed with which it's done. If there's some kind of artificial deadline, like to meet the promise, it's got to be before the end of the year. It's that speed issue, Chantal, that they seem to be worried about.
In fact, most of them, when you talk to them, are not really worried about security screening. They understand that security concerns are driving Canadians to pay more attention to this. But their worry is that everything else is not in place, where these people will land, how they will go about, how many will be where. I mean, this is not something, it's not like rewriting a section of the Constitution. It's got practical incidences, and a lot of provinces and municipalities that do want to do this are complaining that they can't get a coherent answer on stuff like that from the federal government. Now, Mr. Trudeau, I don't think is doing on ISIS the listening thing. It came across for 3 days, those first 3 days after Paris, that Justin Trudeau's message was, it's business as usual, I'm not going to change my policies. And I think something was lost there in the sense that what Canadians did not hear, and they didn't want to hear, I'm changing all my policies, what they did not hear is a clear acknowledgement that something had happened, that it wasn't a storm off the Pacific. It was something that had implications that were worth pondering.
What about C-51? Because it's kind of the third leg of these things that could be impacted by what happened in Paris, and that is the promise to take a new look at C-51, to make changes in areas where the Liberals feel that there should be changes. Does that, we're not hearing much about that here right now. Does that still carry through? Althea?
Yes. I mean, when they talked about C-51, the number one thing they talked about was creating an oversight body in Parliament. Mm-hmm. And that promise, I suspect, is still going to follow through. I mean, they never talked about things like reducing information sharing between departments. If anything, actually, Trudeau came out to defend that practice and the methods that the Conservatives had included in the bill. So a lot of the problems that, a lot of the C-51 activists had, Trudeau didn't support their positions to begin with, and I don't suspect that he plans on rescinding them now because he never said he wanted to in the first place.
Let me get to the question I was teasing at the beginning of this, and that's the question about whether or not the honeymoon is over. And it's prompted by the fact that there have been some pieces. Chantal wrote a good piece today, sort of questioning the performance of the last few days, the last week or so, on a number of key issues, and kind of, in a way, raising that question: is the honeymoon over? The good press, when we saw what the reception was like for the Prime Minister in the Philippines today, but. That's a different kind of rock star quotient. In terms of how Canadians are feeling, what's your sense? Even the relationship with the media, I guess, in some ways. Jennifer, is the honeymoon still on, or is it winding down?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I don't feel that there's a honeymoon at the Canadian press with Justin Trudeau personally. I think we're always trying to ask for accountability and ask tough questions, no matter who's in power. And on the other hand, I don't know where I haven't seen recent polling. I don't know where Canadians are at. I would tend to think that people are still hopeful and hoping that he's going to follow through with some of his promises. But as for reporters and not columnists and so on, I think we're always out to ask the tough questions, no matter who you are, whether you've been in power for 5 minutes or 10 years.
Now, Thea, you've looked at some recent polling. What's it saying?
It's saying that the honeymoon is definitely still on. In fact, people are calling it 11. There's been a couple of polls that have come out, nothing in the last few days, but last week, that suggest more than 60% of Canadians are very supportive of Mr. Trudeau. In fact, 72%, according to a Forum poll, suggested that they were, quite pleased by the election result. 72% is, more people than actually voted Liberal.
Right, but it's
in the last
also
election.
It was before last Friday.
It was before last
changed.
Friday, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that there are things that some Canadians who were paying close attention, and I don't know how many people actually were paying that close attention, probably would have liked to see. Like, I thought his response to the Paris attack was pretty weak. And then we were sort of bombarded by images, and I don't know if that's just the media that's traveling with the Prime Minister that decided to show those images to us, and instead of other images, but posing for selfies and whatnot. That's the media that's asking the tough questions and then fumbling away all the time, right? I'm almost out of time. Quick last word to Chantal.
I think that without Paris, this would have been a great trip for Justin Trudeau. I also think that this honeymoon took a hit. It was going to come to an end. It will come to an end sooner because he missed it on tone. Canadians who were unsettled, deeply unsettled, did not get the impression that Justin Trudeau, fairly or unfairly, shared that feeling and was responsive. And I think there will be a price to pay for that. All right. Got to leave it at that for this week. Thank you all, Althea and Jennifer in Ottawa, Chantal in Montreal.